In the bitter autumn of 1844, the asylums of New England began to fill with a very specific kind of patient. They were not naturally violent. They were not born with maladies of the mind. Instead, they were ordinary farmers, shopkeepers, and schoolteachers who had simply stopped speaking. Some sat in corners, staring endlessly out of frost-rimmed windows, waiting for a sky that had betrayed them. Others wandered into the freezing woods, dressed in thin white linen robes, refusing to eat, refusing to sleep, waiting for a sound that never came. Medical records from institutions in Massachusetts and New York note a sudden, inexplicable spike in admissions during the month of November. The diagnosis, scrawled in the leather-bound ledger books, was almost always the same: religious mania. But insanity rarely strikes 100,000 people at precisely the same hour. When a mass psychological fracture occurs on this scale, leaving behind ruined crops, bankrupted families, and shattered minds, we are forced to ask a dangerous question. What really happened in the dark hours of October 22nd, 1844? The event is recorded in the footnotes of American history as the Great Disappointment. It is usually presented as a cautionary tale of religious fervor, a momentary lapse in collective judgment during an era known as the Second Great Awakening. The stage was the American Northeast, a landscape already trembling with revival tents, radical thinkers, and a desperate search for meaning in a rapidly changing world. At the center of it all was William Miller, a humble, self-taught farmer and Baptist lay preacher from upstate New York. Miller was a man obsessed with numbers. He pored over ancient texts, cross-referencing biblical prophecy with historical timelines, calculating the exact date the world would end. He gathered tens of thousands of followers, eventually known as Millerites, who genuinely believed the sky would tear open in the autumn of 1844. The official story tells us that when the date passed and the sun rose on October 23rd, the followers simply realized they were wrong. They wept, they disbanded, and they went home in shame. That is the accepted narrative, a harmless delusion that quietly faded into obscurity. Yet, when you dig into the archives, the local newspapers of the time, the diaries of the disillusioned, and the records of the newly established insane asylums, a different picture emerges. The timeline fractures. The official explanation feels entirely too neat. What if the Millerites did not just experience a simple miscalculation? What if the collective trauma of that night triggered something far more profound? Something that the history books have quietly chosen to forget. To understand the shadows of this story, we must first examine the light of the official narrative. In 1831, William Miller began to preach that the physical return of Jesus Christ was imminent. By 1840, his local sermons had transformed into a massive national movement. Thanks to the printing press and a brilliant publicist named Joshua V. Himes, Miller's message spread across the United States like a wildfire in dry timber. Using the Book of Daniel, specifically an obscure verse regarding 2,300 days, Miller calculated that the world would be cleansed by fire sometime between March 1843 and March 1844. When that window closed, a follower named Samuel Snow recalibrated the mathematics. He pinpointed a definitive, undeniable date: October 22nd, 1844. The anticipation was absolute. Contemporary accounts suggest that perhaps 100,000 Americans sold their properties, closed their businesses, and left their crops to rot in the fields. They paid off their debts. They said their final goodbyes. On the night of October 22nd, they gathered on hillsides, in meeting halls, and in their homes, wearing white ascension robes, waiting to be lifted into the heavens. And then midnight passed. Then the morning came. The official record states that the movement immediately collapsed under the weight of its own failed prophecy. The followers, heartbroken but physically unharmed, faced the bitter reality of the Great Disappointment. Some returned to their old churches. Others formed new denominations. William Miller himself admitted his error and faded into obscurity, dying just 5 years later. It is a story of human gullibility, neatly packaged and filed away by modern historians. But history is rarely as tidy as the textbooks suggest. The first crack in this narrative appears when we look not at the pulpits, but at the medical records. If the Great Disappointment was merely a sad realization of a mathematical error, we would expect a period of mourning, perhaps severe public embarrassment. We would not expect an epidemic of profound psychological collapse. In the months following October 1844, something dark swept through the rural communities of the Northeast. Dr. Amariah Brigham, the superintendent of the state lunatic asylum at Utica, New York, documented a startling phenomenon. In his annual report for 1844, and subsequently in 1845, he noted a massive influx of patients whose insanity was directly attributed to the Millerite excitement. But Brigham's private correspondence reveals a deeper confusion. The symptoms he described were not typical of simple depression or grief. Patients were exhibiting signs of extreme shock, catatonia, a phenomenon known at the time as brain fever. Some claimed to have heard a deafening sound in the sky that no one else heard. Others spoke of a blinding light that burned their eyes, though there were no physical marks. Why would a simple failed prediction cause symptoms identical to physical trauma? This was not just a crisis of faith. The surviving records describe the aftermath of a catastrophic event. But what was the event? As we pull back the layers, the geography of the madness begins to reveal a strange pattern. The hysteria was not evenly distributed across the Millerite population. The most severe cases of psychological breakdown were clustered in isolated pockets, specific hillsides in upstate New York, certain farms in western Massachusetts, a handful of fields in Maine. If the psychological break was solely due to the passing of a date, it should have affected believers uniformly, from the cities of Boston and Philadelphia to the rural outposts. But it did not. The madness was highly localized. Let us return to the night of October 22. Eyewitness accounts, buried in local archives and dismissed at the time as the ramblings of humiliated zealots, report strange atmospheric phenomena. A dairy farmer in Vermont wrote in his journal that the sky turned the color of old blood shortly after midnight. A group gathered in a barn in New Hampshire claimed the air grew so heavy it was hard to breathe, accompanied by a low vibrating hum that made the wooden beams splinter. Joshua V. Himes, Miller's brilliant publicist, wrote letters shortly after the event that carry an uncharacteristic tone of sheer terror. He did not write like a man who had simply been proven wrong. He wrote like a man who had narrowly escaped something terrible. He urged followers to stay indoors, to avoid the high ground, to lock away the white robes, not out of shame, but out of fear. What were they afraid of? Mainstream historians attribute the scattered reports of lights and sounds to the Leonids meteor shower, or perhaps just the collective hallucination of exhausted, starving people who had stayed awake for days in a state of high anxiety. But meteor showers do not cause widespread catatonia. Exhaustion does not explain why dozens of people across different states reported the exact same low-frequency vibration, a sound they claimed rattled their teeth and snapped their minds. When the official record fails to explain the physical and psychological toll of an event, we are forced to look at the shadows. What if William Miller was not entirely wrong about October 22, 1844? What if his mathematics were correct, but his interpretation of what would happen was fatally flawed? Is it possible that the Millerites, gathering in their thousands on high elevations, projecting intense collective emotional energy into the night sky, interacted with a natural phenomenon we still do not fully understand? Some modern researchers have pointed to the Earth's electromagnetic field. We know that severe geomagnetic storms can cause widespread disruption, but they can also induce strange psychological effects in humans. Prolonged exposure to specific electromagnetic frequencies can cause auditory hallucinations, deep feelings of dread, and vivid visual distortions. Was the night of the Great Disappointment the site of a localized, anomalous electromagnetic event, drawn to or completely coincidental with these massive gatherings? Or perhaps the truth is far more psychological, yet equally profound. What if the human mind, when pushed to the absolute breaking point of expectation, literally fractures reality? Imagine tens of thousands of people, their entire existence, their wealth, their sanity, tied to a single moment in time. When that moment arrived and the fabric of reality did not tear open from the outside, did it tear open from the inside? This theory of mass psychogenic trauma suggests that the believers created a localized break in human consciousness. The sound they heard was the sound of their own collective reality collapsing. The lights they saw were the misfiring of 10,000 overloaded nervous systems. They did not just lose their religion, they experienced a cognitive apocalypse. The most unsettling piece of evidence does not come from a famous preacher or a published newspaper. It comes from an unmarked box of municipal records in a small county in upstate New York, detailing coroner reports from November 1844. History tells us that no one died during the Great Disappointment. But these forgotten ledgers tell a different story. In a 2-week period following October 22nd, there was a cluster of unexplained deaths among the local farming population. The cause of death is consistently listed by the local medical examiner as apoplexy, or fright. One report details the discovery of a family of 5 found in their meadow on the morning of October 24th. They were still wearing their white ascension robes. There were no signs of poison, no signs of violence, no signs of exposure to the elements that could have killed them so quickly. The coroner noted only one strange detail. Their faces were contorted into expressions of absolute, unnameable terror. Their eyes were wide open, staring directly at the sky. The local authorities quietly buried the bodies. No investigation was launched. The records were filed away in the basement of a courthouse, suppressed not out of malice, but out of a deep, institutional fear of the unknown. The surviving leaders of the Millerite movement never spoke of these specific followers. It was easier to claim the movement disbanded in sorrow than to admit that some of their flock had encountered something in the dark that stopped their hearts. Today, the fields where the Millerites waited are silent. The asylums that housed the broken have been repurposed or torn down. The Great Disappointment is a safe, sterile paragraph in high school history books, a testament to the foolishness of trying to predict the end of the world. But when you stand on those hillsides in upstate New York on a cold October night, when the wind dies down and the silence becomes almost heavy enough to touch, the neat explanations begin to unravel. The medical ledgers, the suppressed coroner reports, the localized clusters of madness, they all point to an event that was far more terrifying than a simple miscalculation. We are left with fragments of a story that someone, or perhaps time itself, wanted erased. Did William Miller inadvertently calculate the date of a bizarre natural anomaly? Did the intense collective belief of 100,000 people tear a hole in their own shared reality? Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was simply a series of accidents, the tragic consequence of fragile minds pushed entirely too far. Or maybe, on that cold autumn night in 1844, the people who waited in the dark saw something looking back at them. Something we no longer recognize, and something we can only hope never returns.